Now I want to talk about the philosophical and psychological dimensions of this issue. So I mentioned how there is this deliberate agenda to make the issue abstract and to make it something where it's divorced from the actual lived behavior, the actual living communities of people who practice same-sex behavior. And this is deliberate because then you can mask the actual harm that's caused and the kind of dysfunctionality and deviance that is found when it comes to the lived reality of homosexual behavior. And there's proof of this, and I think an interesting example that comes from a research study done by Jonathan Haidt. And you might remember Jonathan Haidt from Tortured Minds, the course at Alesna, where we talked about weird psychology, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic mentality. So this is the same psychologist, and he did an experiment where he asked people about a brother and sister, Mark and Julie. And he gives this very contrived scenario of Mark and Julie, who are brother and sister, and they go on vacation and then they commit incest. They sleep with each other. And in the scenario that he describes, he mentions that they use protection so that there's no possibility of pregnancy and so forth. And he also specifies that when they do this behavior, that it's just for this vacation and it made them very happy, and then they lived happily ever after. And then the person who is the experimenter who is telling this story to the participants will ask, do you think what Mark and Julie did was wrong? And most participants answered, yes, we do think that this was something that was immoral. And then the experimenter asked, well, why? Why do you consider this to be immoral behavior? And then people respond, many of the participants responded by saying that, well, there is a possibility of, birth defects. A child could be born that's, has developmental problems because of incestuous behavior. And then the experimenter says, well, no, there was no pregnancy, there was no chance of pregnancy. Why do you think that their behavior was immoral? And then the participants really don't seem to have an answer. They don't really know what to say to that, because if you remember from Tortured Minds, they're thinking in purely utilitarian terms. They can only think about moral behavior as being related to harm. If something is harmful, then that's what makes it immoral. And so in this experiment that Jonathan Haidt is doing, where he's asking people and he's surveying them, he wants to make sure to say that there is no harm. There's absolutely no harm. So he makes it abstract. People in reality know that incestuous behavior is extremely dysfunctional. Incestuous behavior is found in communities that are impoverished or in the backwaters of a certain place. It's something that's extremely troubled and troubling. And what this experiment does is it strips all of that context. It strips all of the intuitions that people might have, all of the news stories that you might have heard about this kind of behavior, this immoral, dysfunctional behavior, so that it's an abstract question. Just on this issue, what do you think it's immoral or not? And so this is interesting because in the case of homosexuality, we also find this abstraction. Don't talk about the actual behavior. Don't talk about the actual people who are doing this. Don't talk about the clubs that they go to. Don't talk about the disease, the drugs, all of these problems that are associated with this behavior. Just make it an abstract question. Also, philosophically, it's important to understand this bias that many of us have because of living in the West. This weird psychology as being Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And there was one experiment that I mentioned in Tortured Minds where university students were asked, is it morally wrong for a person to go to the grocery store, buy a chicken, and then have sex with that chicken, then cook it and eat it? And when they asked this of people in these Western universities in America, most of the students said there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. But when people from non-weird places outside of the West were asked this, they universally gave the same answer. No, of course, that's wrong. That's evil. That's disgusting. And that was the reaction. So why is there such a difference between those in the Western industrialized countries versus the rest of the world? What is the difference in psychology? And as if you remember from the course, we talked about utilitarianism and harm, that those with a weird psychology think that morality is purely based on harm. If there is harm, then it's bad. With the chicken is already dead. So the act of having sex with it and then cooking it, there's no actual harm that's caused by that according to them and their conception of harm. And so since it falls outside of a utilitarian calculus, they think that there's nothing morally at stake with that kind of behavior. But what we know is that the intuitions that we have about right and wrong and disgust and something being vile or not are also important. And this is the case with the vast majority of cultures around the world that are not weird, and Islam falls into that. Islam falls into that as well. Our morality is not just purely based on harm. Our morality is not purely based on utilitarian considerations like this. And the counter response to this, someone might say, is that no, we can't rely on intuitions. We can't just base our morality on intuitions. We need reasons. We have to have reasons for why we accept or reject something, consider something moral or immoral. So how do we respond to this? The response is that no, you're not just prioritizing reasons over intuitions. You're simply prioritizing intuitions, one set of intuitions over others. You're prioritizing one set of intuitions and ignoring all other human intuitions that people have. And that's what weird psychology means, is that people who have that psychology are one-track focused on one set of intuitions while ignoring everything else. What do I mean by this? Well, consider this question. Ask someone who has this kind of attitude towards sex with chickens or to homosexuality. Ask them, well, why is harming someone wrong? Why is harming someone wrong? And they won't be able to give you a response. They can't say anything in terms of reasons beyond, well, it's just wrong. Harming someone is wrong. We just take that as axiomatic. Well, okay, that means that you're not giving reasons. So this is another type of intuition, that harming people is wrong. That's one intuition. It's an important intuition that we have, but there are many other intuitions, and you can't just prioritize one intuition over all others. Just because sex with the dead chicken is not causing anything harm, that doesn't automatically mean that it is right. And we see other examples of this too. Is there anything wrong with desecrating a holy book like the Quran? Desecrating the Quran? Is there anything wrong with that? Well, according to this weird psychology, no, because it's a book. No one is harmed. There's no physical harm to a book. But clearly it is wrong. It's something that is sacred. It's something that is holy. And so those kinds of intuitions and considerations are important. And people throughout the world and throughout history have had those kinds of moral intuitions, but we live in a time, a very specific time and place where there's the proliferation of weird psychology. And we're not going to go into depth in this course like we did before. If you are interested in learning more about this, take Tortured Minds if you haven't already. But this is something unique to our time and place, the weird psychology that's purely utilitarian. The only thing that's immoral is something that causes harm. So with that being said, in the rest of the course, we will talk about these actual harms. And essentially what I'm saying is that, fine, you as someone who is, because I imagine that myself as discussing with someone who is opposed to my position, someone who thinks that there's nothing wrong with homosexual behavior? What would you say to this person? How would you convince them and therefore provide wisdom? Like, this, Islam is prohibiting this type of behavior, and there are good wisdoms why Allah has prohibited it. There are wisdoms why. It's hikmah based on why Allah destroyed Qawm Lut. And so it's good to be able to understand those wisdoms. So in what we're saying now is that, fine, you want to ignore all these other intuitions that every religion has had about homosexuality, that this is something immoral, that this is something disgusting, that this is something vile. You want to ignore those intuitions, and you only want to focus on harm. Fine, we'll take up that challenge. We'll only talk about harms. We'll only talk, since you don't have those intuitions, then we're going to talk about the harms of it, and that's what we're going to spend the rest of the course discussing, inshallah.